Yeah, because my phone, my internet, and my TV are all bundled together, so I don't even have a landline.
It's weird. It's still this stuff. And your phone is always so much.
Yeah, I have a work phone, so I was able to call it my meetings and stuff. But it's actually oh yeah, they're totally chill about it.
And actually just gets slammed again. We have a new person.
That was much nicer.
Office is just signing someone I used to work at the new person now. And it's like, I don't even recognize you. You're a child. So,
You know what I mean?
Only put the figures on the book.
Let's see here. How do I do this?
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Yeah, just think that it's even us, so. Yeah, that's all.
Keep getting the live stream going, and then I guess we'll just start with it. You're ready.
Yeah, this live stream is already going, so.
Oh, is it
Yeah.
like streaming now?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. It didn't give me any sort of, hold off for a second.
Oh, okay.
I thought I was starting to test, but I was starting to stream.
okay.
If you'd like to, you can prop your phone up right on the laptop, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Let's see if that's better. Yeah, it's probably better. Sure. All right, let me see. All right, cool. So I guess we'll get started then. My name is Tim McLaughlin, and I wanted to kind of do this in kind of three quick parts. The first, kind of want to introduce myself and the story and stuff like that, and then talk a bit about the publishing because I do a non-standard type of publishing. And then after that, get more into detail in the story itself, and maybe pause for questions or discussion after each of those bits. So as I said, my name is Tim McLaughlin. I live right down the street here on New Ipswich. My wife and some of my kids are here. And I spend my time, writing and preaching. I'm in school to be a Baptist pastor and working down over in Townsend. And you may know me as a library trustee, or if you don't know me, it's because we just moved to Ashby in 2019. And so the pandemic significantly impacted our ability to meet the people of Ashby. But originally I'm from Western PA, in a town called Sharon, which is part of what's now the Rust Belt. It was a steel town that, the steel industry left, and that influenced a lot of my kind of aesthetic and the way that I view things. There's a lot of urban decay kind of around where I grew up. And there's kind of this blend of Appalachian spirituality and ideas and Midwestern folklore that comes together in that area. And so I grew up in that environment, and that influenced a lot of kind of how I view the world and how I describe things. In October of 2004, I took a vacation to Chicago. And while I was there, I ended up having kind of this experience, this vision involving this ghost that was said to be residing in one of the bathrooms. And this girl who was living in the apartment at the time, who was a witch, claimed to have been in communication with her. Like, she claimed to have been trying to communicate with this ghost for a while. And so we talked about that a fair bit. And this wasn't like the first or last encounter I've had in my life that could be probably accurately described as supernatural. It wasn't even the first or last on that trip, but that one stuck with me for a bit. And a few weeks later, I ended up having a dream about a fictionalized version of that event. And I got curious about kind of the characters in that dream, and I started to explore that, and I started to write stuff out and map out this whole story. And it took a lot of years and trying out couple different forms like webcomics or novel or whatever to try to figure out the best way that what format this story really belonged in, where it lived. And ultimately, as I fleshed it out and as the tone settled, it became apparent that this was a story with elements of both paranormal horror and urban fantasy. The core difference between those is basically focus and the nature of the supernatural. So in paranormal horror, you have a lot of ghosts and witches and vampires and things like that, where the main threat is that the unknown is coming to get you. There are things out there that you don't understand that mean you harm, and it focuses a lot on the people who go and fight those things. And it can happen in basically any setting, but usually tends to be a rundown version of that setting. So if it's in a city, it's kind of the abandoned parts of the city. If it's in a building, it's an abandoned building. It's things like that. Whereas urban fantasy takes standard fantasy elements like elves and gods and fae and puts them into the modern day, and it hides them. Urban fantasy relies a lot on the supernatural being hidden in the shadows of the mundane. And it talks a lot about the people who cross from one world to the other and kind of explore these differences. And urban fantasy, basically as a rule, is set within a city context, usually within the last 100 years. So Tall Tales incorporates both. It has ghosts, it has witches, it has fae, it has gods. A lot of it takes place in my hometown area. So you have this Rust Belt, which is this city setting, but a very kind of running down city setting, or this rural setting that's kind of surrounding it. And the stories themselves, Tall Tales is composed of a series of short stories, and each one has varying focus. And so some of them are more horror, some of them are more fantasy. And in 2018, what I decided to do with it was to do a serial fiction and epistolatory format. Epistolatory is similar to Dracula in that it's letters and in-world documents and things like that. This story is told mostly through blog format. And those blogs tell various short stories. So throughout Tall Tales, here's this short story. It's a self-contained narrative that then ties into a larger story as they're all connected to each other through similar characters, through similar situations, through stuff like that. So technically, the Tall Tales books aren't novels, they're collections, because they're collections of short stories, but they tell one large story the way a novel does. These short stories mostly they follow a paranormal investigator who's immune to magic, a Catholic priest hunting a cult, a witch that's seeking to understand the nature of magic, a biology student discovering her connection to the supernatural, and a few others as they kind of are moving towards this common fate that they're all bound towards. And it includes folklore and myths that are being folded into the larger narrative. In the books, there's a story called The Devil's Church and another one called the Venusberg, which are each just tales that already exist in the real world. The Devil's Church is a bit of folklore from back home. The Venusberg is a bit of folklore from Germany. And I borrow elements like Hecate. Hecate, being from Greek mythology, is a recurring character throughout Tall Tales. Each of those characters that I mentioned has their own goals and their own stories, and these play into all of this, but I'm gonna dive into that more when I get into the actual story. But that's kind of the big picture of what Tall Tales is this collection of short stories that are urban fantasy and paranormal horror that go through and tell this much larger story when they're all put together. So that's kind of the introduction section. So I want to open up if anyone has any questions or comments about it so far. I can't see the YouTube thing, so I don't know if that's supposed to be available for.
Oh, I think it's switched
away.
away. Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
So if there's anybody chatting, I wouldn't.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So does anyone have any questions or thoughts about kind of that big picture stuff?
Yeah. Did you mentioned that you were interested in different formats, and was that more exploratory? Did you start publishing in different formats like webcomics or like?
It was largely exploratory.
Yeah.
So the very first thing I tried to do was a webcomic with a friend of mine named Alex. And so he was drawing and I was writing, and we were working through, we actually did come up with a lot of material. He drew a lot of comics and a lot of character designs and all this other stuff. And I mapped out a lot of storylines that I ended up continuing to use in later formats. But we never put any of it online. We never did anything with it. I tried Tall Tales. It was called Madison PI at the time. It wasn't called Tall Tales because it was just about the one character. But I tried Madison PI in a few different formats. Like I tried to write it as a book and I didn't like it as a standard novel. I tried to do things like that, and none of it ever came to fruition. I just knew that they didn't quite fit, and so it took a while. But it was exploratory.
Yeah. Was it tough to get into? I forget the word that you used. Epistolary?
Oh, epistolary. Yeah. So I didn't know. I full confession. In high school, when we were supposed to read Dracula, I just didn't. And so that was the one test in high school that I cheated on was that one. So I didn't entirely know that this was a thing that existed. But I started writing it. When I started writing it and doing this, my wife was like, this reads like Dracula. Like, you should look into that. And so when I looked into that, I found out that this, epistolatory was a thing. But actually getting into it was fairly natural for me. Like I decided, okay, I'm going to do this in first person. And I started doing it in first person. And I was like, oh, if I'm going to do that, I should like have it be letters and records from in-world and all this other stuff. And that would be great. And that would be cool. And it seemed like a cool idea that I thought I'd heard about, like, that other people had done. I didn't think it was a fully original idea, but I didn't have any concrete examples in mind. But when I started doing it, then my wife was like, yeah, this is a thing. Like, one of the most famous books in the world does it. And so.
It's funny how karma kind of got you.
Right.
By cheating on that test.
Yeah.
You could have been more efficient in your process.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And there was things like I didn't actually know it was horror at first. Like when I was writing it, I was thinking, oh, these stories are fantasy. Like I'm writing them urban fantasy. And so I was doing that. And people were reading it and be like, there's some scary stuff in here. Like someone was reading the first few stories on the website and they were like, there's this sense of dread that's just kind of there all the time. And I was like, that's a horror description. And so I went to a friend of mine who is a librarian and I was like, hey, can you read a couple of these stories and tell me if there's horror elements here? Should I be warning people, hey, this is urban fantasy with horror elements? She came back, she was like, no, this is horror. Like that's what that is. So there was a lot of that type of thing where it's like, my lack of research beforehand really caught up to me pretty quickly.
Now, are they like gory horror or just sort of psychological horror?
Yeah, so they are, as I understand it, because I end up having to learn a lot about horror after that conversation, they would be classified as cosmic horror. So it's not so much that there's, like H.P. Lovecraft and stuff like that. So there's not so much this is all in your head, like psychological horror, and it's not so much this is all blood and gore and stuff like that. Actually, there's very little violence that's on screen, but there are things out there. The world is a lot darker place than you realize, and there are things out there that make everything you know about the world a little bit wrong. And when you start butting up against that, it creates a lot of problems, and the human mind isn't really capable of handling it. And so that's kind of, it ends up flowing much more in that direction as far as types of horror go. But yeah, like I said, there's very few characters that actually like you see them die or things like that. It tends to be very much like, you get all the setup or you get all this happened, but you're seeing the effects and the results and the things that people are exploring that lead them to those places. All right. So the second part was publishing. I want to talk a bit about the publishing process. Because of all this, because it's not really it's somewhere between a novel and a collection. And I was trying to do, kind of these various stories, various different stories with these different perspectives and everything. I ended up going with a split model. And the first part of that is the online serial. So I started publishing it in late 2018 online as serial fiction, which is very much where you take the story and you tell it in pieces over time. This used to be a much more common model, like Charles Dickens. I think all of his books were written originally as serials in magazines, bit by bit, and he got paid by the word, which explains a lot about Charles Dickens. And you went through and you would have to tune in each time to get the new magazine, get the new thing or whatever, to continue the story. And so that format has kind of faded out of the limelight. But I felt that the internet provided a great opportunity to bring it back. And it seemed like a natural fit for this story. And so what I started to do was write it as blogs. And so each part of the story was a blog post on these blogs on the website. And so as you work through, like you get an update every week from each blog. And then a second blog was added. And okay, now you get 2 story bits each week, but they're different stories. And by the end of volume 2, I had 5 blogs going. So you were getting 5 posts a week, but it was from 5 different perspectives. And, that was a bit tricky to keep up with, but, it did. I'm not doing that currently. I stopped doing that as kind of the intro to volume 3. I did the very beginning of volume 3, just a couple storylines to kind of tease it. And then I phased that out because it hasn't been the focus that readers have gone for. But all the stuff that I did put up is still there. It's a complex reading structure doing it that way. And I haven't found any other serials that are doing quite what I did. There's actually a lot of web serials online. There is actually a whole serial fiction movement happening online right now that I didn't know about when I started out, but I was very excited to find as I dug further. But they tend to be one perspective, one story, and you get updates with some regularity. And so the problem that I was having is that when I was telling 5 different points of view, 5 different stories in a serial format, it got very tricky for people to keep up with. And I think that's part of why the serial format, people had trouble with it in terms of readership and stuff like that. I do still kind of feel like it was the best way to tell the story, the way that I had structured it, but it was overly difficult on readers. And this came up with my wife, and a couple people were asking me, like, what's the reading order? Like, how should I be reading this? Where do I start? How do I figure out where to go next? And I would tell people, well, you can pick a blog and read through it, or you can start here, you can start here. And my wife was like, no, give people a reading order. Like, give them a structure, give them somewhere to start, and then a sequence to go through. And I hesitantly did do that. So if you go now to talltalesuf.com, there's a link to start here, or you can just put /start. And that'll take you to a little page with a quick video where I explain kind of what's going on, and then a button that says next. And if you just keep clicking those next buttons, you'll work through every single post on the website in a set order. And that means that you'll be bouncing between blogs, and you'll be bouncing between perspectives, but it'll read much more like a book does, because you're just going through and, okay, now we're getting this whole short story, and now we're getting this whole short story, and go bit by bit through. So that's now there on the website and has been for about a year. So that's available. But the thing that my wife was still kind of mad at me because it's not the same order as the book. So,
Why do you have 2 different orders?
I didn't think about it.
Okay.
When I was sitting down and doing the book, I organized it in a way that I felt worked for the book. And when I was organizing it on the website, I sat down and I organized it in a way that I felt worked for the website. And afterwards, my wife was like, why is it not the same order? And I was like, I don't know. It didn't feel right. And I didn't think about the fact that I'd already picked an order for the book when I picked this order. So I just did that. And so, yeah,
it's another reading order in mind.
Huh?
Do you have, or not order, but do you have like a reading experience in mind that isn't linear?
Yeah, so well, none of them are linear. They're broadly like kind of the main plot, I guess, is in chronological order, but a lot of the events, like a lot of the stories in it, aren't. And so there's stories that take place in like 1400 something that is, I think, the first post you read on the website, but like the third story you read in the book. And there's just kind of different things like that where not all of it actually happens in sequence or in order. And so none of it is linear necessarily, but there are other ways that I think are worth reading it. Like one of the ways that I encourage people to do is to pick a character, because there's these 5 blogs and 4 of them are written by individuals in world, sort of. And pick a character, start at the beginning of their blog and just read their story. And there's structures in place to allow you to do that. And I think that would be an interesting experience for people. But again, that's not the reading order that was imposed on the website as a whole.
Right.
So
When you started posting them on the website, had you written them all, or were you writing them as you were posting?
I was writing them as I was posting them, and there was a number of bad ideas involved in that. As I got deeper into it, I got more and more structured, like planning out. Before I started writing by the time I got to where I was writing volume 3, I didn't write anything until I had the whole thing mapped out. I knew what post was going to go up on what day and how it was going to play into the book and everything like that. And so I gradually did that. At its height, I was writing things about a month before they went on the website. But when I started, I had a few weeks worth of posts, but it was only one blog at the time. A few weeks worth of posts written. And then by the time I launched the second blog, I had a couple of those written, but I was writing as it was going up. So
That's hard if you get writer's block.
yeah, so I suffer from chronic migraines. And so every once in a while it would just go on a hiatus. I just have to post like, I can't think right now, and writing isn't happening. And it would nothing would post for a month or two. Because then I was, it's okay, the time to deal with the headache and recover and then write some more so that when I start, I'm not publishing it right now. So that would happen. And I actually took a year off at one point where I said, I'm just going to write as much as I can for the next bit ahead of time so that this doesn't keep happening. But yeah, it was tricky. It was very difficult trying to keep up with it. And I should have learned that lesson when I was doing a webcomic, but somehow I didn't.
Did you have readers that were like after you, like you hear about the readers after the author of Game of Thrones who like stalk him at
Right.
coffee shops and are like, when are you gonna, they feel like they're at a cliffhanger and they need to be.
There are a couple people who come back to me fairly frequently, like, when is the next bit coming? Like, I need to know what happens next. There's a couple people that do that, yeah. One of them I see at conventions, almost every convention we go to. And so the fact that I'm not doing conventions this year, I feel like I'm going to hear about that next year. So that was one of the streams where I was doing the online channel, the online serial. And then I decided to self-publish the books. I was taking each kind of broad section of it that I had split it into, in my head, 5 volumes. And so each volume, when I complete it, I then put it into a book. Was what I did with volumes 1 and 2. I'm focusing on the books now, for 3 through 5. But I decided to self-publish it to a publisher. It goes to Simon & Schuster or Penguin, Random House, or whatever. And that's traditional publishing. It's very dynamic market going on there, and there's a lot of issues happening with it right now. There's a lot of problems in traditional publishing right now, and I knew pretty quickly that this wasn't going to have a home there, and partly because traditional publishing likes to operate in very strict boxes as often as it can. and Tall Tales doesn't fit most of the boxes that they like right now. But also because there's a significant time investment. Going through the traditional public, so people could finish a volume and buy a book, or even maybe buy a book just before the posts were all up, kind of as an incentive. I couldn't wait 2 years after the volume finished publishing on the website to see it. And that's, like I said, that's an optimistic number, 2 years. And so that time frame really didn't work for me. And so I decided to go with self-publishing. There's also indie publishing, which I think Jerry, who already did a presentation, is technically considered indie publishing because he goes through an actual publishing house that has some resources to throw at what they're doing, but they're not one of the big houses, and they can actually, I don't know if he has an agent or not, but I know that you can approach those publishers without an agent. And so that's a whole different world, and they tend to be more flexible, especially in the realm of fiction. They tend to be more flexible and explore more ideas and stuff like that. But again, there's the whole time limit of they're going to take this thing and they're going to take it to to editor, and they're going to do all this other stuff, and they're going to hire an artist at some point later on down the line, and then publish it. And so you're still looking at a long lead time that I don't really have any control over. And so I went with self-publishing, and there are some dangers inherent to that. Like, for instance, I have to do all the editing and the art or pay somebody myself to do it. As it happens, I do the vast majority of it. I get some help with editing, but by and large, I write the story, I edit the story, I draw the pictures for the story, I arrange the book, and I arrange the publishing. I use Kindle's print on demand process for publishing, but yeah, I do the whole process up until I hand it off to actually be printed. And there is some stigma associated with self-publishing. A lot of people kind of view self-publishing as a consolation prize, like you couldn't get it signed by somebody, and therefore this is an inferior book. And some of that sticks around in a lot of places. Like there's an organization in Massachusetts that does a dinner for at least fiction authors who have been published in that year. Like they get them all together and they have a big gala and they celebrate, oh, you got your book published this year and all something like that. And self-published authors are not allowed in that. And it's really hard to get, like I have a lot of hurdles to get through if I want to get my books into Barnes & Noble or things like that. And obviously I have to do my own marketing because I don't have a marketing team. And so there's a lot of stigma that's attached to it that affects a lot of this, but it's one of those things where it's like you have to weigh the pros and the cons. And I decided that having the control over what went into the book and when the book was published was worth taking up all that extra work. And so this was, so as people, like I said, kind of view it as something where like, oh, you couldn't get it published, so you went self-publishing. I never pitched it. Tall Tales has never gone to an agent. It's never done any of that. I knew very early on that this one needed to be self-published, and so it always has been that.
Do you think that some of the stigma is going away now that so many authors who started with self-publishing have gone on to become pretty successful?
So there is a little bit of that happening, where the stigma is starting to drop a little bit, and some of it is that. Some of it is because of the problems with the publishers themselves right now. Like the publishing industry, some parts of it are kind of falling apart. I mean, HarperCollins has had a strike going on for a couple months now. That they only just agreed to even come to the table. And so people are seeing all of this happening. And they're seeing, during the pandemic when people were all working from home, and it was very clear that agents and editors and a lot of these people in the publishing industry could be working from home and it wouldn't affect anything. When they started demanding everyone come back to the office and live in New York City and not paying them enough to live in New York City, they went very public with this. And so the industry right now is going through a lot of turmoil. And in the midst of that, between that and kind of these AI-generated covers that are starting to come out now, and things like that, a lot of people are starting to look beyond those publishers, and they're starting to discover that, indie and self-pub are not just consolation prizes. There are a lot of things that exist here on purpose and are really good. And so there is a shift happening. I don't know how large of a shift it is yet, but I know that it is happening. All right. So the last bit, I want to talk a little bit, kind of a bit more detail about Tall Tales. So because it is set up in a very blog format, I'm going to kind of talk about it as the blogs. But when you're reading the books, they're not like they're grouped that way. So if you open the table of contents, you'll see some stories say like benediction at the beginning or Madison PI at the beginning. And what that means is that this is a story that belongs to this author in world. You know, the Benedict ones belong to benediction, or the benediction ones belong to a character called Benedict de Monte. Madison PI belongs to John Madison, stuff like that. And so it's still kind of structured that way in the books, but it's not as overt as it is on the website, obviously, when you're literally on a different blog's website. So the first personal blog that appeared on the website is called Benediction. It follows a guy named Father Benedict de Monte. He's a Catholic priest. And he has been tasked with tracking down this cult called the Brood of Nakash. And so a lot of his stories are going through and dealing with this cult and researching this cult. And he picks up this character who's a Naga. Her name is Akshani. And so the two of them are kind of working together on this investigation, traveling the world, studying the cult, dealing with the leader of the cult, who's called the Barzai. But the structure of it is different than the other ones in that it's not in-world a blog. Benedict isn't writing it. In-world, it's actually files that are being collected for a trial that will happen at a later point, I think in volume 4. And so there's all kinds of things, like there's things from Benedict's notes, and there's things from McShaney's notes, and there's things from these other people's notes, and there's transcripts from the Vatican, and there's, you know, all these things that they're kind of pulling together. And that's what the blog format is just these files. And Benedict, as a character, shows access to some powers that are kind of beyond human capacity, and so that becomes a major sticking point because he's a Catholic priest, and the Catholic Church doesn't much like magic, and so there's some strife there that comes up with that as well. And so that blog kind of follows that. Madison PI follows a guy named John Madison. John Madison is an amateur paranormal investigator who lives in Western PA, and so a lot of the stories happen in and around my hometown area. He's what's called an anchor, which is kind of a thing I don't have a whole lot of exposure to in folklore. It's sort of created for this and sort of borrows from a couple different sources, bits and pieces. But essentially what he is he's a walking source of anti-magic. So in his presence, magic breaks down. People can't cast magic too close to him. He can't cast magic. He can actively stop magic from working, things like that. But that comes with an ability to see and interact with the metaphysical realm. So where all the spirits and ghosts and everything are at, they can see him, he can see them, they can talk to each other, he can punch them, they can punch him. And like, this is just kind of a hassle in his life is how he approaches it. Like he's constantly has to deal with all of these spirits that want his attention, and he doesn't always really want to. But, you know, because he's kind of stuck with that anyway, he starts doing these paranormal investigations with his friends to kind of understand more of this and learn how to deal with it better. And there are some kind of recurring issues that are coming up that seem focused on him. Some of the villains throughout the series are very tied to him. Jeremiah is one of the recurring villains, and that's Madison's grandfather. Hecate seems to have a particular interest in Madison. When he meets the Barzai seems very interested in Madison, and he doesn't entirely know why yet. And so he's very central. If Tall Tales has a main character, it's John Madison. And so a lot of the story ends up coming back to him in some way or another. Over the Hedge is written by a character called Jackie Veracruz. She's a witch who was trained in kind of ancestral. Her family is from Central America, and she kind of has this native practices that she's learned. But as she got older, she started studying under a tutor who turns out to be Hecate. And so she learns this very kind of European Greek style magic that comes up a lot. And her thing is very much that she's trying to understand magic. And so a lot of her blog is notes on the way magic works, mixed into her experiences and this stuff. And one thing that really stands out through that is that in Tall Tales, in the world building of Tall Tales, magic is kind of theoretical. So in a lot of world building systems, you kind of have to decide how much is concrete and how much do I show the reader is concrete. And in Tall Tales, since it's all first person, it's assumed that the characters don't actually know how magic works. They think they know things, and the things that they know work, but they're occasionally shown that what they think is true is wrong. And this actually happens in the very first storyline in the first book, where Madison introduces the idea that magic can't happen around me. And by the end of the storyline, a very important spell happens in very close proximity to him. And when he's asked why that worked, he's, I don't know. And there's a certain amount to which magic is never fully explained in Tall Tales. They have their theories, they have their ideas. They'll say, okay, this is how this works. And sometimes that explanation is allowed to stand, and sometimes it isn't. But what does happen is throughout the series, they know enough about it to make it do what they want it to do. But it's very clear that it's much more complex than they realize. And there's a certain amount to which the reader kind of has some flexibility to figure out, I think the rules actually work more like this.
Do you have any sort of elder characters who do or claim to fully understand, or is that something not welcome in the story?
So there are a couple characters who are implied to understand a lot about it. Hecate is described as the goddess of magic. And so she very much looks as though she knows all of it. But there are times when because there's these two characters called the Ravens, or the Two, or King and Queen is kind of their actual name. And they're alternately described as like ruling over the metaphysical realm or actually being the metaphysical realm. And there is this weird personification. And occasionally she has issues with them. And it's not entirely clear. Like it's fairly clear that what they're doing is beyond her scope. And there's a point at which Jackie wants to learn time-based magic. And she asks Hecate to teach her time-based magic. And Hecate is like, I don't actually have access to that, but I know someone who does. And so like she's described as being, she knows everything there is to know about magic. But even she has shown, okay, there's actually this limitation that she has in these couple places. So it is kind of implied that King and Queen do know absolutely everything, but they notoriously don't tell anyone anything. They show up in story occasionally and mostly like give just little nuggets of information, just enough that you know like what you need to know to move on with what you're doing, but they never give straight answers. And then there's Wonderland. Wonderland is written by a character called Alice Templeton. This one was introduced in Volume 2. She doesn't appear anywhere in Volume 1. She is a biology student living in Pittsburgh. She encounters magic, and as she starts kind of being curious about it, she's like, oh, I want to know, like, apparently this is part of my world. I want to know more about it. She's a very science-minded person. And so she starts poking into it, and in the process learns that she actually has a connection to it, and that's why she was aware of it. And so she's kind of exploring that. A lot of her stuff in Volume 2 is very reliant on Madison and Jackie. Like, she enters the story through knowing them, through meeting them, and a lot of her involvement centers on them. She's going to come more into her own in Volume 3 and Volume 4. But in Volume 2, she's mostly, at the very beginning of the introduction of her blog, she's almost an accessory in some stories to them. But she's growing as it goes on. And the last blog on the website is the narrator blog. The narrator blog is presented as just stories that are happening that are outside of the scope of the other blogs, but are relevant to the story. So this is characters that are important to the story, or events that are important to the story, like that story about the Venus, or that the story about, I said, happens in like 1405 or whatever. That's on that blog because that it introduces a character that becomes important later. But the narrator blog is kind of told mostly as just, here's the story that happens. But occasionally the narrator would be like, and I saw this, and I was here. And it's a couple times that happens. There's no explanation on who they are in the story. They just kind of seem to be witnessing it, but talking in first person suddenly. In one story, the person who does that is King, one of the two that I mentioned. And so it's kind of implied that he or they are the narrator, but there's a lot of stories happening, and it's not entirely clear if they're even all supposed to be told by the same person. But that blog is kind of fills in everything else. It's everything that's outside of the knowledge of the other characters, or things about Benedict that aren't part of the case file that his blog is, that are kind of being collected into this one other stream of story. So the books are volume 1, which is published, mostly introduces the characters, follows Madison and Jackie dealing with the fallout of a botched exorcism, and introduces Benedict as looking for the cult, the Brood of Nakash. Volume 2, the Brood of Nakash becomes a much bigger issue for everybody, and so they're kind of the main thrust of Volume 2. Volume 3 is going to focus a lot on Jeremiah. I'm writing that one right now. There are certain thematic elements to them. Volume 1, I kind of view each one as tied to an element, and so Volume 1 is water, Volume 2 is life, Volume 3 is fire. And so like that is reflected in the covers and in the types of stories that are chosen for it, but it's not a very overt theme. But there's going to be, like I said, a total of 5 volumes. I'm currently working on number 3. There are a couple other things that exist or are in progress. I have a short story called The Blind Guides, which was published 2021, and was during 2021. It was only available at in-person events, and then in 2022 I made it available to everybody. During 2022, I had a story called Purgatory that was only available to in-person events, that is now available to everybody. I'm working on a podcast that will air later, called Voice from Another Room, where this character that leaves the story at the end of Volume 2, and he goes off on his own story that's not necessarily relevant to what's happening in Tall Tales. He's taking like these little recordings of the investigations he's doing, and that's going to be a podcast at some point later down the line. I'm working on writing scripts for that here and there, but I can't focus on it while I'm doing the books. So it'll start airing after Volume 5 is done. And like, there's ideas about other things. Like there's the characters that are introduced that I might write a novel about, stuff like that. But that's where things are right now. So there's the 2 books, the 2 short stories that currently exist, the 3rd volume that's currently in process, and the podcast that's currently in process. And
This may be too much of a sort of process question, but
that's fine.
how do you keep all of the different, because you've got a lot of different elements going on, how do you keep them all, sort of all those different balls in the air? Do you have it all mapped out?
The timeline. It's a file called the timeline. And in my mind, everything is an adaptation of the timeline. Like the timeline is the story, and everything else is just how I'm adapting it for audiences. And what it is, it's a document that I have on my Google Drive that just, this event happens at this time, this event happens at this time, this event happens at this time. And so I have who is involved and what happens and an exact date and stuff like that, spanning the bulk, like there's events that just say like antiquity or first century or whatever. But the bulk of it spans, I think 1945 to 2032. And it's just, I go through that, honestly. And so it's fairly easy for me to kind of like, okay, well, where is this character right now? I can look at the timeline. They're here. Okay, I know what they're doing. I know where they are. I know what's happening with them. And so I can think about it, very in a sort of structured way where I can go, okay, I'm focusing on this area, and I have this resource over here that tells me where everybody is at this point and what they're doing. And so I know what I can and can't do, and I know where this is going, and I know all this other stuff. And so then when I go to write the story that takes place there, I can kind of do it. It's almost in isolation. Like I'm not trying to balance a bunch of balls at that time. I know where they all are. I'm just writing this story, but I know in my head, this character isn't available, so they're not part of the story. This character isn't available, so they're not part of the story. This character is available, and so I can make them part of the story. And this story has to lead to this point. And so I can write with that mindset going, but I can focus on just that story that I'm writing in that moment.
Do you have that timeline semi-concrete now? Like do you know the direction everything's heading when you write it? Or-
Pretty much, yeah. Because I've gone through and I've edited and I've read it and I've done it a lot. And so there are times when I'm writing, I'll be writing a scene and I'm thinking about, the climax of Tall Tales or this scene that's going to happen in a story, 3 years before that or whatever. And because I have all that, I've done it enough that I have that in my head where I can recall it when I need to. Yeah, so enough of it's in there that I can do that.
How long, where in the process did you concretize that? I don't know if that's a word, but.
It is, strictly speaking, the version of the timeline that's on the Google Doc and the version of the timeline that's in my head aren't 100% accurate to each other. I haven't finished putting some details that are in my head into the document. And so I guess you could kind of say it still isn't. It's still setting.
Yeah.
But it's set enough.
Yeah. Did you set it from the beginning, or has it been
No. Back in 2005, I had the climax. I knew this was where the story was going. This was the climax, and this was the result of the climax. I knew what the big mystery of Tall Tales. I knew what the answer was, and how that mystery goes back and affects other things. But it took a very long time to kind of get the rest of it down. I didn't know that I was going to write a blog about Jackie until about 6 months before I did. And there's a lot of it that is still kind of formulating and being figured out. Where I'm kind of letting it, I know that I know A and I know C, and I'm kind of figuring out what B is, Yeah.
How much would you say that the community has influenced?
In recent years, not very much. And that's partly because there's not a very large community, if I'm honest. Until I started doing conventions, I knew of 3 people who were actually invested in the story. And other than me. And now that I'm doing the convention, I'm selling the books, I'm getting some people that are at conventions that are interested in it, and people that just buy it, because they have to be attending a convention and then see me the next year. Between those things, I'm starting to get that, but I'm not really getting a whole lot of is this what's happening? Conjecture or things like that I would really be using to think through stuff like that. But very early on, when I talked about when we were doing the webcomic, my friend Alex, who was doing the art, he and I would work out a lot of details of story stuff and everything, and he would introduce ideas and stuff like that. And so some of that has very much persisted. And so there is a touch of his influence still there. And Carol and I will talk through it, and she'll help me come up with ideas or settle things or whatever. And so she has an influence. But the larger community doesn't exist in force yet enough to be having much of an effect yet.
And I don't know how to ask this in a way that I don't know, but have you ever considered the idea of having it become a collaborative thing, since you are writing from multiple perspectives and multiple blogs?
This part of the story, no.
Yeah.
I have done stuff like that. My webcomic was supposed to be a project like that, where essentially the webcomic was just a vehicle for me to explain the world building and then hand it to people to tell their own stories in. And there is the ending of Tall Tales will allude to things that happen in the future that I'm not planning on writing. And so if other people want to write that, I encourage them to do so. And I am making a tabletop campaign, a system to play it as in that world as a tabletop campaign. And so like in terms of that, yeah, take the world and run with it, have fun with it. But in terms of what's actually going to be in Tall Tales, no, that portion of it I haven't ever considered like making a collaborative effort, turning it into a collaborative effort.
I'm mostly asking because it sounds like a lot of work.
It is a lot of work.
That sort of leads into my question is, you've got a job, you've got a family, you're going to school, and this seems like a very big time commitment. How do you give yourself the space to dedicate to a project of this size?
I have had to scale it back at times. I only recently started working outside of the home again. I was off for a couple of years, focusing on school, but that meant that I was a stay-at-home dad, and while the kids were in school, I could devote like, okay, I'm going to spend 2 hours every day just writing, and that was fairly easy to do. Now that I'm working, I'm still kind of figuring out, okay, I have to cut that back, and I have. And I'm still kind of figuring out how the balance looks now. But it's one of those things where it's like, she's really encouraging. My wife is very much encouraging me to finish it, and she wants to see this happen, and she wants to see it get into the hands of readers and things like that. And so as long as like I'm there for my family and I'm meeting my obligations, she's very encouraging of me taking the time to, okay, we're not going to hang out tonight. I'm going to go write. And stuff like that. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, then thank you very much. And I do have some copies of the book here. You online can't see that there's not a whole lot of people here to buy them, but we do have some stuff. I have business cards and bookmarks and things like that, and we can hang out and chat for a bit. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think unfortunately the people of Ashby are probably clearing trees from their yards today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People would actually are trying to get out their homes.
But I think that today is a particularly bad
Yeah.
day.
Snowshoed yesterday for the first time since last winter. And I grumbled the entire way through. It was like miserable, and because it was ice over snow.
Yeah.
And it crunched, and there was stuff down everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah.
And it's like, why am I doing this? Is not fun.
But I do think that everybody's yards are just a disaster. And
Yeah.
because, like Thursday night, it was dark, so nobody could do, anything.
Some people have been out for days.
Yeah, so I think that this was just unfortunately a really bad,
I don't know how to stop people that stream.
but I'm hoping that, so we'll post the live stream, the copy of it, we'll post on the website, and hopefully some people will watch it.
I would think there's